So welcome everybody to our podcast series, Leading in a Climate Changed World. And today we have the great pleasure and privilege to talk to Dr. Raj Thamotheram. Raj is founder and CEO of Preventable Surprises, a think-do tank, as opposed to a think tank, a think-do tank, focused on how investors can better manage systemic risks. After co-founding the Nuclear Freeze campaign and Safer World, Raj worked in the development sector at ActionAid, where he was head of international advocacy, and the Ethical Trading Initiative as its first director. He then moved to where he feels the power really rests, which is in the world of finance. He worked for 12 years in the investment world as the head of ESG investing at one of the UK's biggest pension funds, USS, and as a global fund manager with AXA IM. He is a well-recognized pioneer in the field of long-term and responsible/sustainable investing and writes regularly, including a monthly column for Investment Pensions Europe called Long-Term Matters. He also lectures widely, and most importantly of all, he is also with us today. So welcome, Raj. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Robin.
And maybe I could ask you a very broad, general question about how are you personally feeling about the climate emergency?
Very mixed. Sometimes I'm very angry when I think about the fact that people are happy to accept that we're on a path for 4 degrees warming, and that means, probably billions, certainly hundreds of millions of people dying. People who've had, marginal contribution to the problem. People who are not yet born or very young or poor. So that makes me really angry. I then get really sad, I think, when I think about how blasé we are about that catastrophe. And that's not to mention all the biodiversity loss, the ecosystem loss. What else?
Are you hopeful?
I think it's essential to be hopeful, and I work hard to be hopeful. Some days it works, some days I just feel a bit despairing. Some days I just feel blank. And I think the most important thing I feel is that, this train is rolling at us. And it needs bravery and courage to respond to it. And it's going to hit us. It is hitting us in different parts of the world. So I think it's the feelings are really important. The actions are critical.
And how do you, if I could just follow this personal thread for a moment, like how do you also work with those feelings of anger, sadness, maybe fear at times? Like, do you consciously work with them, or you just kind of notice you have them and you drive on with action-orientated days? Or,
I've also been diagnosed with a terminal cancer in the last couple of years, and I kind of deal with the two things almost like they're some mix of the same story. It's not great news. You wouldn't wish it on anyone, and you need to thrive. I need to thrive in that situation. And there are some things which help me thrive. And one of the things that helps me thrive in the real world around climate change is doing something which I think is constructive and useful. Same with the cancer. It's, eating well, enjoying life well, being around friends, getting the right therapy. There are things which help and there are things which don't help.
Yeah, well, I don't know if expressions of sympathy help or not, but we certainly want to extend our sympathy to you also.
Thank you.
That diagnosis.
Yeah, thank you.
And you also made a decision, as I said in the introduction, to focus in on the world of finance as the place where things happen. So is it still your experience? Is finance one of the main levers that we need to work with around the climate emergency?
I oscillate in my mind between thinking policy and finance are the two levers. Government policy. I think on most days, the corporate world, the people who chug out the greenhouse gas emissions and cut down the rainforest and, et cetera, they are responding to signals from the finance industry. And I think that's where a lot of change could happen. I've been doing this for, as you said, a couple of decades now, and I'm pleased to see that people are, in very important positions about Mark Carney, Bank of England, etc., recognizing that finance is probably the critical challenge, critical sector now.
So when you say corporates are responding to signals from finance, maybe you could spell that out a bit for our audience. Not everybody will be familiar with what you mean by that.
Sure.
What are the signals? Are corporations responding?
Yeah.
Changing also.
The most important one is the executives of companies, the CEOs and all the people underneath them are rewarded very handsomely for delivering the quarterly number, the shareholder value capitalism concept, right? They're strongly incentivized to deliver a share price which is that goes up, and in order to do that, they have certain targets, and those targets largely don't involve anything to do with what we've just been talking about. On the contrary, with high impact sectors like the fossil fuel companies or the energy utility companies or the auto companies or the industrial meat production companies or a whole range of sectors, they're actively incentivized not to worry about this stuff. And guess what? When you have clever people getting a large amount of money not to worry about something, let's not be surprised when they don't worry about something.
So who is worrying about something? Like where are the seeds of hope? And if we're also looking at leadership, where's the leadership in the finance? Let's start in the finance sector. Where are you experiencing what's needed now?
Well, when I joined USS, which was something like in excess of 15 years ago, nearly 20 years ago now, it was a very niche issue to be involved in climate change. I remember when I set up the first meeting of something called the Investor Group on Climate Change, Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, we were going in a taxi and a senior executive at my company, at my firm, said, "I hope the meeting's a success, Raj, because it would be career limiting if it wasn't for you." It turned out that it was a great success and a packed meeting, and IIGCC is now a major global player, and certainly in Europe. But at that time, it was quite rare, and now it's not. There's an organization called the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, and it has members who account for about 50% plus of all the investment dollars in the world, 1 in 2 investment dollars. So at one level, we've gone well past the tipping point. At another level, the incrementalism of the ESG or responsible investment project has resulted in very little real world change. And that gap between what the project was intended to do and what it's actually doing is why I set up an independent, non-conflicted think tank and advocacy group.
And what have been the major fruits of Preventable Surprises?
We have a very large network of what we call positive mavericks, Robin, and I think you'd probably enjoy that term and the people. These are people who are within organizations trying to push their senior management to do more than the organization wants to do. Often they're acting without any formal authority and without any official remit to do what they're doing. And we work with them to encourage them, to keep them on their toes, like a tough love coach might do. And they allow us to do it, and it's a voluntary relationship. We don't pay them, they don't pay us, but we collectively raise the standards of what's acceptable. So one of the things that we've been pushing, for example, is that the key thing that investors could do in relation to companies is to be forceful stewards, assertively engage as owners, and ask the companies that they invest in and lend to produce transition plans aligned with the Paris Agreement, net zero by 2050 at the latest. And that was for several years way ahead of where investors were at. Investors were happy to ask for scenarios and vague declarations, and we and others have helped investors firm that up.
Sounds great, and I'm happy that you feel there's a level of engagement that is useful for sure. And I'm wondering if we were to scan the globe now and look for the leadership, as you know, this is a podcast series about leadership. Sure. Where do you see, not only in finance sector, but including the finance sector, where do you see the kind of leadership that we need to bring about the corrections that we need and with the urgency that we need at the moment?
Not in finance, sadly. I think I'm most motivated by, excited by the leadership role that young people are playing. You know, Greta Thunberg is a household name, but it's much, much more than Greta, right? It's, you know, it's individuals who we don't know and are not famous, who've been doing very similar things, and for reasons which are completely unpredictable. She's known and all of them aren't. And they're striking, they're talking to their parents, they're marching, they're basically calling out adults for their immaturity and lack of authenticity. And I think that's a very healthy sign. It's a very uncomfortable feeling to be told you're being irresponsible by young people, but it's true. The intergenerational responsibility of the leadership group, the people at the top, is unquestionable. The other people who I'm kind of really interested by are the middle level managers in organizations who are kind of pushing down and pushing up at the same time, and who are expanding their space to operate despite being kind of formally asked to. And these are the people that we work with in the finance sector, but there are people in government, people in public service, people in science, people in corporations, etc. And last but not least, there are some individuals at the top who are pushing. They are a small minority.
Could you name a few?
Yeah, I mean, they're people who sadly everyone knows because they're so few. Paul Pullman, formerly at Unilever, Antonio Guterres from UN Secretary General. You know, these kind of individuals in different sectors are going well beyond what their peers are doing. And it's dangerous for them. You know, Paul Pullman's no longer at Unilever. So it is a understandable, it is understandable that so few people who are focused on the normal leadership agenda are avoiding dealing with this existential crisis.
Right, and let's speak a little bit about the middle managers, because I imagine quite a number of people who listen to this might feel themselves in that kind of band. I mean, there will also be some CEOs who are listening to this, but people who are middle managers, because we often feel and work with some of those people too, and it feels like there's often a sense of, well, I can't really do so much because the CEO or the board doesn't really get it or doesn't really back me. But what's your experience of the leverage and the power that the middle managers also do have?
Can I say bollocks?
You can certainly, you've just said it.
So I think in a friendly way, I would say that's rubbish. The middle management have huge influence in an organization of course, they're being squeezed from both ends. They're vulnerable. They're facing all the same risks that the top management are, but they have tremendous power to both call their leadership into account, but also provide safety for the staff below them to take action in their own sphere of operation. Obviously, if they're in silo A and they try to meddle in silo Z, they will be slapped down and told to get back into their box. But within their own silo, they have huge space. They have space about who they recruit. They have space about how they incentivize behavior. And different companies, different organizations, different firms could do a lot at the middle management. I call it middle out change.
Yeah, that's very inspiring to hear, because, as I say, we often hear that there's a limitation, but you're also speaking to the potential and the power that there is at that level also, both to kind of manage up and to create a safe space for the people that they lead too. So, of course,
I think, and this I'm sure is nothing new to you and your network, but leadership is not a position in an organization, right? It's a choice of activities which distinguish the person from being a execution, operational, or even a management person, and that's what I mean by leadership.
Yeah, and I think we would agree with that, and maybe we can build on that and tease out some of the core qualities or characteristics of the kind of leadership that we need at the moment. So you've spoken about Greta Thunberg, someone who's speaking truth to power. There's courage. What other kind of qualities do you see needed at the moment? And also, how can we develop those in people?
I think a really critical quality is the ability to collaborate across divisions, silos, outside one's box, outside one's span of management. So I see people in my sector, in finance, for example, who are pushing the boat, collaborating with competitors. I see them collaborating internally with people who might be considered obstacles. So, for example, in my own experience, I'm aware that some of my most impactful actions came from building alliances with the risk officer or the legal head or the head of marketing or whatever, because these people have mainstream spheres of influence, and the CSR, ESG person is in many organizations a kind of bolt-on. And unless ESG professionals, CSR professionals build those kind of internal alliances, they're going to be treated as marginal.
And maybe, again, because we have a very mixed audience, maybe you can just spell out what CSR and ESG stands for people.
Yeah, sorry. We all have our jargon, don't we?
Yeah.
CSR is corporate social responsibility. So these are the people in companies who are typically dealing with climate change or biodiversity loss or social issues as well. And their equivalent in the finance community are typically referred to as ESG professionals, environmental, social, and governance professionals.
Right. So you said something very interesting about collaboration and collaborating with competitors. And I wonder if we could take a little look at that, because that's a very radical thing to do. And I wonder what enabled some people to do it and what the fruits are. And maybe you could just speak a bit to that.
Sure. It's not that radical. A lot of sectors operate very collaboratively to protect their own interests. Trade associations, for example, are institutional mechanisms for that kind of collaboration. So to challenge what you just said, I don't think it's rare. It's not being used in order to deliver societal benefit. And that's what I'm talking about. It's pre-competitive collaboration, basically. It works best, I think, at a sectoral level. So, for example, mining companies post the Vale catastrophes in Brazil, where many hundreds of people were killed and huge environmental damage was done by the dams bursting. The sector as a whole has decided to belatedly increase its safety standards for those kind of dams. The same happened with the nuclear industry post Fukushima, the Japan crisis. Sadly, the sectors tend to wait until some horrid problem has happened to react. And what we need to do with the impending climate crisis, or the climate crisis that we're starting to experience, is to move into mitigation and prevention activity before the worst of the crisis has hit, because by the time that happens, it's way too late. It'll be way too late.
Right. So I wonder if we can build a bit more on other qualities or characteristics you think are necessary in leadership at the moment, and where you might be seeing some of those things. You also mentioned Mark Carney earlier as the governor of the Bank of England, as someone who was kind of getting it, but you said there also isn't really enough of this leadership in the finance sector. So I guess there's limits to power and influence also.
Yes. I mean, Mark Carney is a regulator at the top of his game, leads the Bank of England, and has used his position in the international network to trigger other regulators to come together, the French, the Dutch, the whole range of other regulators. But interestingly, although Mark is Canadian, the Canadians have been very slow to come to the game. They are kind of observing the situation now. And the people who are almost uniquely not in the game in terms of national banking regulators are the Fed, the US. So it's not a function of intelligence or training or resources or any of those issues. It's a function of lack of conflicts of interest and bravery. And in petrostate countries where regulators or corporate executives have been captured by that culture, there is an unwillingness to stand up. You see it in Russia, you see it in Gulf states, you see it in Brazil, you see it in the USA, you see it in Australia. You see it in many countries where the government is captured. And sadly, you see it in the corporate sector too. Some of the very biggest financial sector organizations are headquartered in the US, and they're doing amongst the least of the banks, the insurance companies, the investment consultants, etc. And I think that's brought home to me that, in these global sectors where all the executives go to the same kind of Ivy League or equivalent business schools, they go through the same professional indoctrination process, they have the same training, the same culture, they move around organizations almost like geography doesn't matter. On issues like climate change, suddenly cultural norms become very important. And that's the challenge that we have to break through.
Right. Say more about that. The cultural norms have become important.
The backdrop to globalization and how modern finance operates is that you could have a passport which is from any country in the world, but you will have been educated probably at one of a few leading business schools, and you would have gone through typically a global accreditation process. So, for example, the CFA for investment people. So, at one level, regardless of, you know, what your nationality is, what your language is, what your passport is, you think and act and respond in an identical fashion to your peers anywhere in the world. There is much greater peer cultural cohesion than, you know, what your passport is and what your mother tongue is, aside from climate change. And a few other issues where values and ideology kick in. For example, gender, for example, anti-discrimination issues. But climate change is, I think, it's most obvious now. So, for example, just to get nitty-gritty, there is an organization, can I mention names?
Yes, please do, yeah.
Okay, so there's an organization called Marsh, which is a global player in the insurance world, and it has multiple subsidiaries, several of which are very competent on climate change. Mercer Investment Consulting, for example, is very competent on climate change. Marsh itself produces the annual risk report for the World Economic Forum, and this annual risk report over many years has been notching up that climate and environmental issues are the biggest, the most dangerous risk issues that the corporate world faces. And yet Marsh is not even signed up to the very basic TCFD process that Mark Carney kicked off.
And why would that be? Why would they not sign up to that?
It's also it's one of the brokers for the Adani coal project in Australia, which will have a devastating impact if it kicks in. Well, I would love you to talk to senior people or even middle people at Marsh, but I think I use them as an example because they have all the competence within the group to know about the dangers of climate change. Indeed, parts of the group are selling themselves strongly on their competence to deal with climate change. You know, this is not an Exxon kind of organization. But when it comes to the group as a whole dealing with the problem, and that's the challenge that we face with the large financial conglomerates, many of whom are actually US based. It's a cultural bias which is deeply problematic. And you talk about leadership, and I'm fascinated by the example of John McCain, Senator John McCain. Mm-hmm. He was very, very early on one of the Republicans who got climate change. He co-sponsored bills, etc. You know, and he was very happy to take on Donald Trump and a range of other people on a range of issues. So he was no you know, he challenged racism when that person in his audience accused of Barack Obama of being whatever. So he was no pushover. But interestingly, as the Republican Party moved more and more into the extreme climate denialist Tea Party kind of mode, John McCain became silent about climate change. In his book, just before he died, he sort of did all the mea culpas that one does when one's facing death, and he didn't mention climate change. So I think there's a cultural challenge we face in a sort of willful blindness of the people at the top, which the rest of us have to compensate for, because actually they're taking society, civilization down with them. And we just have to do everything we can to mitigate that problem.
Yeah, and you spoke earlier about one of the characteristics of the leadership we require is to not have a conflict of interest. And the way you've set up Preventable Surprises gives you access in a very kind of direct way.
Yeah.
And I guess conflict of interest is something that we can structure around, but I'm also, I know you need to go travel in a moment, but maybe we could also close with a sense of what is trainable. You talk about bravery, courage, collaborative spirit. Some of these things we can support and develop in people. Some are innate, and things like conflicts of interest we can also structure. So what would you say is excuse me, what would you say is trainable for the kind of leadership that we require now?
Well, I think one thing is to do much more active international benchmarking. So why is it possible for all the central banks that mean anything to be part of this network, but Fed not? You know, what does that mean about the fear and self-censoring of the people who are decision-making at the Fed? Similarly about insurance companies. The insurance companies, the European and even Australian insurance companies are taking climate change into account in quite serious ways, certainly in underwriting, but also investment. Practically none of the US insurance companies are doing so. What does it, so kind of peer group benchmarking to raise standards and embarrass the laggard behavior, I think could be very useful. Mm-hmm. I think people within these organizations, I note that, you know, staff at Amazon and other companies have challenged their executives in public at AGMs about their lack of action. You know, why aren't we seeing that at the large banks, at the large insurance companies? Those are the things. Of course, it's risky. It's people are worried about career risk. People are worried about promotion possibilities. But that's where the space to operate comes from. And, you know, a company management is not going to sack 20 of its brightest talent individuals. People coming into an organization have huge influence. You know, ask the recruiter, ask the head of HR, ask the the headhunter. Does the company accept climate change is human created and anthropogenic, and does it have a plan? And if it doesn't have a good answer, choose another company and tell them why you chose that. You know, we've all got spaces to operate, and I think my hope is that your network really use our spaces to the maximum.
Yeah, thank you. That's maybe a very good note to close on. We all have spaces to operate in, and let's have the courage, the bravery, the commitment to work within the spaces that we do have. Thank you so much, Raj. And
thank you for your...
Very well. And with your health challenges also, wish you very well with that.
Thank you.
Hope to see you thriving into the new year, and I'm sure we will meet again before too long.
My motto is living adventurously, and we have no choice.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Robin.
Bye, Raj.